Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our book talk in celebration of Women's History Month. My name is Emily Guthrie, and I am the librarian here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. If you're tuning in to a Library Company event for the very first time, we're excited to have you. And if you're a regular at our events, we really appreciate your loyalty and support. The Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. We are free and open to the public and hold an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving, interpreting, and providing broad access to the collections in our care. The Library Company regularly presents exhibitions, lectures, symposia, conferences, and other programs in order to make the collections accessible to the widest possible audience. Our book talk tonight is sponsored by the DeVita T. Deutsch Program in Women's History, an endowed program that enables us to promote the study of women's history through research fellowships, exhibitions, acquisitions, and public programs. Some of you in the audience tonight likely came to know the program in women's history through the excellent work of Connie King, our longtime chief of reference and curator of women's history. While Connie retired in August of last year, the Library Company continues to benefit from her innumerable contributions, including the selection of this year's Women's History Month speaker. And so I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Joan Johnson. Joan, if you'd like to turn on your video now. Great. Dr. Johnson is director for faculty at Northwestern University. Prior to joining the provost's office, Dr. Johnson taught women's and gender history at Northeastern Illinois University. She was the co-founder and co-director of the Newberry Seminar on Women and Gender at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and has written extensively about the history of women and gender, social reform, education, and philanthropy. Her books include Funding Feminism, Moneyed Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, 1870 to 1967, Southern Women at Seven Sister Colleges, Feminist Values and Social Activism, 1875 to 1915, Southern Ladies, New Women, Race, Region, and Club Women in South Carolina, 1890 to 1930, and she is the co-editor of a 3-volume series titled South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times. Her latest book, and the focus of her talk tonight, is The Woman Suffrage Movement in the United States, a text for college courses published by Routledge in 2022. The book brilliantly ties together an array of lesser considered perspectives on the suffrage movement, including the garment factory worker working for protective labor laws, the wealthy wife hoping to control her inheritance, the Black activist seeking voting power for her community, and the temperance worker wanting to vote for prohibition law, to name just a few. The volume examines the crucial activism of Black suffragists and other women of color, as well as the fraught nature of the cross-racial coalition in the movement. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. I was initially planning to come speak at the library in 2020, and we know what happened to that. So I'm really pleased to be here now to speak with you. So if you just give me a second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And I wanted to start off by asking, there we go. I'd love to hear from you as to which women suffragists you're familiar with. Maybe some that you've heard of that you can name, maybe some you even learned about in the last couple of years when we had the 100th anniversary. You can just go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll see if we can get some names in the chat. Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells, great. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ida B. Wells. Zikala Sa, wonderful. Alice Paul was the leader of the National Women's Party. Jane Addams, I'm here in Chicago speaking to you. And of course, she was the suffrage leader and Settlement House leader here in Chicago. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two of probably the best known in the movement. Anyone else? I see several for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay, well, that is a great start. And what I hope to do tonight is to help you to learn a little bit more about who else wanted the right to vote, and really among the women that you mentioned as well, why they wanted the right to vote. And what we'll do is we'll kind of jump around the country. We'll go across regions, across class, across race, and we'll see that there were women all over the country who wanted the right to vote. And sometimes for very similar reasons and sometimes for very different reasons that had to do with who they were, what they did, where they lived, etc. And then we'll spend most of our time on that. And then we will talk a little bit about some of the tactics and strategies that suffragists used, because remember, they had to convince men to give them the right to vote. So how did they get to men? How did they make the case to men to get the right to vote? And then who got the right to vote in 1920? What exactly happened with the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920? Who was voting in that presidential election in that November? So let's start with who wanted the right to vote and why. And I'm going to back us into the 1830s during the abolitionist movement against slavery. And here we have Maria Stewart, who was born free in Connecticut. She was a Black woman who was orphaned, married, widowed soon after. But she was very active in the abolitionist movement in the North that's really just beginning to take off and grow at that time. And I think she's really important for several reasons, one of which is she's known as the first woman in America to speak to give a public lecture to what they then called a promiscuous audience. And so that meant to an audience mixed gender of both men and women in a public setting on a public political topic like abolition. So she was the first. And it was quite radical that she did it. And she's also really important because, as you can see from this quote, what she's doing is really speaking to all Americans, to Black Americans in particular, and also to women in particular. And she's talking about the need for women to take a role in the abolitionist movement and for civil rights for Black Americans much more generally. And she wrote this in The Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper in 1831. And then the following year, she gives a series of several lectures in Boston. And then she got some grief about it, basically, as a woman doing these public lectures on this political topic. And so she eventually will stop lecturing. She becomes a teacher. She moves to Washington, D.C. She has a very active life afterwards, but really just that one small public moment. And I think she's very important as well for helping us to see her position as a Black woman and thinking about her intersectional experience of racism and sexism and her the strong ties that are formed initially with women in the abolitionist movement and the beginning of a new movement for women's rights. So in addition to her speaking out, we also had Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the two white sisters from Charleston, South Carolina. They come from a slave-holding family, and they will eventually move north, spend time in Philadelphia before ending up in New Jersey, active in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which was interracial. And they also begin to speak out against slavery as well, and they also are criticized for it. So when ministers actually begin to criticize them for speaking out against slavery and again, sort of saying, you know, women need to be in their place, and this is not a political issue that they should be publicly speaking and writing about, Sarah Grimke's response really was that both men and women are created equal. They're moral and accountable human beings. And so therefore, women need to do the same thing. They are accountable for the same moral stance against slavery that men are accountable for. Like Mariah Stewart, the Grimkes were very deeply faithful and really come to the movement from their position of faith and their idea that God created meant all people equal. And they expand that to be talking both about race as well as about sex, and that God created human beings across the races as well as men and women equal. And that really becomes their position. So what we see at the beginning then of this beginning women's movement in the United States is women coming out of the abolitionist movement, finding their voice, refusing to be silenced, and really speaking out on this political topic, using the rhetoric of equality and natural rights and equal rights and human rights that people in the abolitionist movement are applying to Black Americans, to women as well, white women and Black women. So they're motivated, they're inspired by anti-slavery rhetoric, they're inspired by these arguments about natural rights and equality, and they're looking at their own oppression as women as well. And so they become active. Women begin to write petitions in the 1840s that demand the right to vote for themselves, as well as to form organizations and hold conventions. And so the first women's rights convention in the world was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And this was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who many of you are familiar with, the daughter of a lawyer in New York, a very well-educated white woman who had married an abolitionist and come into the movement that way, and had become friends with and was part of the network of abolitionists in New York, Philadelphia, in that area. And so along with 4 other white women, in July of 1848, they got together and they decided to call for a women's rights convention to be held. They held it about 10 days later and had over 300 people come, which is really remarkable. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And what she says, as you can see, is we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And based on the Declaration of Independence, she does what Jefferson did, which was to lay out the ways in which the king had been a tyrant and taken away the rights of the colonists. And in her case, she lays out the ways in which men have been tyrants and had taken away the rights of women. And the first 4 points that she makes are all about how women do not have the right to vote. And that's what silences them and takes away their voice and allows for then oppression to follow. So because they can't defend themselves, they can't make laws and have a voice to defend themselves, that's how they are then excluded from professions, excluded from higher education, and through the system of coverture. As married women, they did not have legal rights. They were legally covered in the system of coverture by their husband's legal identity, kind of subsumed into it. And that meant that they could not hold property and have other kinds of rights as married women. In the Declaration of Sentiments, she actually refers to them as civilly dead. So she's quite strong on that. After the 1848 convention, women held a series of women's rights conventions annually right up until the Civil War. And then at the end of the Civil War, these women, abolitionists, former abolitionists, now active for civil rights for newly freed Black Americans, are looking at what should the new position of people after the war be? What are the rights that Black Americans need, especially Black men? How can we protect their citizenship? How can we protect, and should we give them the right to vote as well? And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who you see here, as well as Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, and Frances Harper, who was an abolitionist, women's rights activist, as well as an essayist and writer. They were all they formed the American Equal Rights Association. And this organization was intended to fight for rights for Black Americans after the Civil War, but also for women. And they promoted the idea of universal suffrage, that everyone, regardless of race or sex, should be entitled to the right to vote, that this was a right that all citizens were deserving and should have. And what happens is that the former abolitionists, Republican politicians in the kind of old formation of the Republican Party, which changes over time, but at that time, they had been the party of Lincoln, and they passed the 13th Amendment to end slavery, the 14th to guarantee citizenship, and then we're working towards a 15th Amendment for the right to vote for Black men. And Stanton and Anthony thought this was an opportunity to push for a 15th Amendment that would give universal suffrage for everyone, regardless of race or sex. But the idea of women voting was still considered to be quite radical. And Republican men knew that Black men would vote for them as the party of Lincoln, but they weren't quite sure who women would vote for. They might vote for the other party as well. So for those and some other reasons, they really pushed for the 15th Amendment as just for Black men, so that you cannot take away the right to vote on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude for men. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony dropped that universal idealistic human rights kind of vision, and instead begin arguing that women should have the right to vote before Black men or immigrants, who Stanton refers to as ignorant. And she really devolves into quite racist language, tropes, associates herself with some real vitriolic racist demagogues. And both Stanton and Anthony explicitly say that they will work against the 15th Amendment if it does not include women. And so Harper and Frederick Douglass and others in the movement are really horrified and call them out for their racism. And the American Equal Rights Association dissolves. Eventually, Stanton and Anthony will form the National Woman Suffrage Association, and Harper will belong to the American Women Suffrage Association, started by Lucy Stone and Harper and others. But we have these two groups. Stanton and Anthony's is working against the 15th Amendment, whereas the AWSA was of the mindset that they should work for that first, for the rights for Black men to have the right to vote, and for all women to follow. And of course, in this kind of language, what you'll notice is that Stanton is talking about women having the right to vote first, but she's clearly talking about white women. And we see that Black women are really being erased in this kind of rhetoric. However, the idea of universal suffrage doesn't go away, and it really remains a part of the suffrage movement right up through and past 1920, really. This is Charlotte. Well, this is actually Frances Rowland. I don't have a photo of Charlotte Rowland, but this was a family of 5 sisters, and they were all very active in South Carolina at the end of the war. Black women working with the newly entitled to vote Black men in South Carolina. And you can see that she says, we don't ask for suffrage as a favor or a privilege, but it's a right. And not only is it a right, it's a right that based on the ground that we are human beings and therefore entitled to all human rights. And she gave that speech to a women's rights convention in Columbia, and then she joined the American Women Suffrage Association, and she was at their national convention as well. We also see that idea really continue, as I said, and one of the places we see it is with Irene Mormon, who's a New York City suffragist, who talks about the square deal. And that means that the vote is really for all people. And she says, don't do anything for us because we're colored men or women, but again, make it humanitarian because it's right. And this human rights argument is really a through line that continues through the movement. In addition, however, what we begin to see in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, 1890s, are some new arguments being put forth for why women should have the right to vote. And this kind of opening up of the suffrage movement is really, I think we can give a lot of credit to Frances Willard. Frances Willard was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was very well educated. She served actually as the first dean of women at Northwestern when they admitted women, which is where I work today. And she then became president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a new organization in the 1880s that was working to pass laws that would prevent alcohol sales. And the idea behind it really was to protect women and children, that drunk men were being abusive, spending all the money and creating poverty and abuse for women and children who were suffering at their hands, basically. And so she starts to talk about the need for a home protection ballot. And this kind of phrase is so much more palatable. It's much more palatable to talk about women needing the right to vote in order to protect their homes, in order to protect women, in order to protect children, than it is to talk about it as a human right or a woman's right, right? So this new approach that women, they're not trying to empower themselves, they're simply trying to protect their homes and to protect children is a lot more acceptable, both to many men who they need to convince to vote, as well as to many women. And so what we start to see is working through the Women's Christian Temperance Union to get women to work for the right to vote as a home protection ballot, the movement begins to really open up. And that's where we're going to see this dramatic growth from kind of a very small a movement centered in the Northeast, tightly connected to the abolitionist movement, to really a mass movement that's going to be all across the country, California, the South, the Southwest, really all over the country, and with all kinds of women, many of whom were not abolitionists, many of whom were not willing to demand women's rights, but could talk about the need to protect their families. Many of them were active in the new progressive movement, so they're working for better education for children. They're working for libraries. They're working for better sanitation. They're working for clean milk for children. So they're active in all these kinds of movements. And in all these cases, they're talking about women's need to have the ability to protect their homes and to protect their children. So this is a really important change in the movement. Now I put Frances Harper back because she is also active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In fact, she becomes a national officer. And she's also talking about the home protection ballot, although she talks specifically about the need to protect Black families. And so that Black families were in particular suffering from abuse and violence, and women could use the ballot in order to protect Black families, to pass the kind of legislation and vote for the kind of people who would have more protections for Black families. So that's important. Now, Harper will eventually leave the her position in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and become active in the National Association of Colored Women. Mary Church Terrell, who you see here, was one of the presidents of the National Association of Colored Women. And this was a new organization of Black women's clubs, a national organization. And they're working for all these kinds of benefits for Black families, including education, protection, et cetera, as well as for the right to vote for women. And this is really notable because Mary Church Terrell, the quotation that you see here, is from a speech that she gave at the National Association for Women's Suffrage, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, annual convention. So she was invited to the convention and invited to speak. However, at other conventions, Black women were explicitly, as well as Black men, explicitly excluded from those conventions. And so she and Harper, I think, really well represent this tension within the movement following some of the racism we were talking about earlier, in which Black women are both included and excluded. There are moments where there are interracial groups, there is cooperation between Black groups and white groups, both at the local level as well as at the national level, but there's also a lot of exclusion. There's a lot of arguing for the right to vote in ways that will exclude Black women and try to reassure, especially Southern white men, but not just limited to Southerners, whose vote they are looking for, that this will not, if they pass the right to vote, it will not include Black women. So they're at times explicitly making that argument, which leads many Black women to really center their activism in the National Association of Colored Women and in Black women's suffrage groups that were separate from the NASA or the national organization. There were many other women who also wanted the right to vote for particular reasons, depending on who they were and what their experiences were. So this is Rose Schneiderman. She's a Polish immigrant, comes with her family in the 1890s. Her father died, leaving her and her sisters and her mother. So she goes off to work. At the age of 13, she eventually becomes a garment worker, a cap maker, and becomes very active in the garment workers' labor movement at the time. She's one of the leaders in the shirtwaist strike of 1909, which is known as the uprising of the 20,000. And she's arguing that women need the right to vote because they need to be able to vote for better wages, vote for laws that will be maximum hours that you can work in a week, and other kinds of protections for a safe workplace for women. So she sees this particular need that working class women have. And she's also able to answer some of the anti-suffrage language by talking about the experiences of working women. So while some white men had been arguing that, women can't have the right to vote because it would be improper, the voting space is a male space. There's drinking, there's smoking going on there, and they would really be defeminized if they were voting. That was a masculine thing. And she says, really, women in the laundries are not going to lose. They're in terrible conditions, right? They're in these terrible working conditions. So they're not going to lose any of their beauty and charm by putting a ballot in a ballot box once a year. So I think she gives a great approach from the working class women's point of view. At the other end of the spectrum is someone like Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. She was married to Willie K. Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of the Commodore, the railroad tycoon. And this is their little cottage, their summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. So she's an extremely wealthy society woman in New York City. And yet, she sees herself as having a lot in common with Rose Schneiderman and the other working women because her husband was cheating on her blatantly. And she felt that despite all her privilege, despite her race, her class, her enormous wealth, that he was being abusive and she couldn't do anything about it. That he could cheat on her and she had no say. And it was really very unusual for a society woman like her to get a divorce in the 1880s, 1890s. But she ultimately does. And she sees this sort of sense of sisterhood, that it's men who are abusing women, and it doesn't matter if you're wealthy or you're a working woman. It could be your husband, it could be your boss, that men are keeping women in subjection. And she sees this idea that there can be some sense of sisterhood between the wealthy women and the working class women. And in particular, this is going to come out through her support and the support of many other wealthy women. They were referred to as the Mink Brigade, who support the strike in 1909. And in fact, Alva Belmont rented out the Hippodrome in New York City so that they could hold a rally to raise money for the strikers. In the of shared experience and sister, but that didn't always go over all that well with working class women. And they felt that in some cases, women like Belmont were trying to dictate with their dollars, that they were too powerful and tried to take on leadership because they had the money. And so you see this quote from Leonora O'Reilly, who's another garment worker and leader in the strike, who's saying, well, they have good intentions, but they don't really speak our language. And also they use the working women and then throw them over. So there's not a lot of trust. There's a lot of resentment. And women like Belmont really kind of make women like Rose Schneiderman and Leonora O'Reilly bristle. There were many other pockets of women who were interested in the right to vote, again, because of who they were and what their needs were. So one group is the College Equal Suffrage League. And so this was originally made up of alumni who had graduated from many of the new women's colleges, including Bryn Mawr, as well as the new coeducational schools as well. And so they were particularly interested in promoting suffrage and in making sure that women had the right to vote, had the right to education, and to enter into the professions. There were also, historian Wendy Rouse refers to queering the suffrage movement, and the many lesbian couples who were involved in the movement, as well as women who were challenging any kind of gender and sexuality norm in the way that they dressed, as well as their partners. And so Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt were two of the presidents of the National Association, who you see here in lifelong partnerships with women, Frances Keller and Mary Dreyer, and you can see here the kind of ways in which they were challenging appearance and dressing in what would have been considered masculine form, as well as Lucy Diggs Slowe, who was the dean of women at Howard, very well educated, and her partner, Mary Burrell. And of course, women in relationships with other women would have also particularly needed the right to vote and access to professions in order to support themselves and education. And these women certainly believed that, and they really thought that the right to vote would help them to support themselves, have more rights and more respect, even as they were challenging gender roles. Birth control activists at the time were also big supporters of the suffrage movement. There was a lot of cross relationship there. Many of the names that you see in the suffrage movement, you'll also see in the birth control movement supporting Margaret Sanger in the early 19-teens. This is Mabel Lee, who was an immigrant from China. She immigrated as a child with her parents and lived in New York City. She's ultimately will get her PhD. She goes to Barnard and then gets a PhD. And she was a suffragist. You can see that she's actually in the suffrage parade on the left and featured in the newspaper as a quote unquote Chinese girl who wants the right to vote. And she is influenced by what's going on in China. So the revolution in 1911 and changes in which they were demanding more rights for women in China, the end of foot binding and other kinds of rights, and demanding the right to vote in China, although it's just kind of localized and it's not a national right until the 1940s. But she, I think, really well represents the fact that this was not just a movement in the United States, but it was happening around the world. And many immigrant women in the United States were not just influenced by what was happening in the US, but also what was happening in their home countries. They were also very important for speaking to the men in their communities, and that meant in their languages. So Maria de Lopez was a suffragist in Los Angeles. She's in the local college suffrage league there, as well as in the Votes for Women League in Los Angeles. She gives a speech in 1910 in Spanish and helps to translate the literature into Spanish. Mabel Lee's mother translated the literature as well. There was literature in Yiddish, there was literature in many languages so that they could reach the men in their communities. And this is Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, a Native American woman from the Dakotas who ends up in Washington, D.C. with her father. She becomes a lawyer and she's fighting for Indians' sovereignty and rights. And she comes into the movement with the knowledge of the history of some of the rights that Native women had, which varied according to tribe. But she says, you know, we kind of had virtual suffrage since time immemorial, given the power that many women leaders in different tribes had. So I think these give you a really good sense of the different kinds of arguments and reasons for wanting the right to vote that women around the country had. Now, how are they going to make it work? How are they going to put those reasons into play and use some tactics and strategies to convince men to get the right, to give women to vote for the right to vote? So first of all, they needed to have headquarters so that they could be much more visible. And they did have headquarters in New York City. Alva Belmont actually paid for them to have those big headquarters. And with this map, it's a little hard to see, but you might be able to see that there's these many headquarters across Manhattan for different women's suffrage organizations. And these allowed for them to get together, to build community, to have a presence. On the first floor, they would have literature. People could come in. Some of them had even like a lunch counter. So you could come in and they could attract a lot of people. And then they had a lot of room, usually upstairs, for offices for staff, so that they could have staff who could make a real difference and put on real PR campaigns and do all of the research and writing and work that needed to be done to organize and to make their case. For Black women, they often didn't struggle to have access to the same kind of spaces. And, you know, right through the civil rights movement, many times they would be meeting in churches. This is Irene Moorman again. She was an entrepreneur in New York City. She was particularly concerned about being able to have some space. And so she started the Mormon Harper Company to create a space that Black women's organizations and Black organizations could meet at. And she then later will meet with Alva Belmont and actually form a branch of Belmont's organization in Harlem, which Belmont then paid for a headquarters for them. And so that's kind of the reason that Moorman is attracted to working with Belmont in order to be able to have that space, because she understood how important it was. In addition to their spaces, they're also creating space for themselves by speaking in the streets, taking over the streets. And this was such a novel idea to see, especially some of the wealthier women out on the streets speaking, that they were called open air speakers, and they had to give each other lessons on how to organize and actually do this kind of speaking in public. And they also organized the parades. And I think many of you are probably familiar with some of the parades that they held, especially in 1913 in Washington, D.C., right before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. The parades were beautiful. They were well organized. They were, you can see the way they were lined up, perfectly organized, the costumes, the banners. It was really a show, and it was a way for women to take over the streets, to demonstrate that they had become a mass movement, that there were, you know, strength in all these numbers, that there were thousands of women marching and thousands of people in the streets watching them. In Washington, D.C., I think it was particularly important, you know, the seat of the government, that they wanted to have a space there, and really showing the importance of that. And you can see how organized they were. This was the suffrage march line, and the way that they lined up in various groups. Now, one of the more famous stories that some of you may be familiar with is that of Ida B. Wells, who was a civil rights activist, journalist, originally from the South, spends time in Memphis, and then ends up living in Chicago. And she's a suffragist in Chicago, and there was quite a bit of cooperation. She's quite friendly with and participates in, she's quite friendly with many of the white suffragists, and her colleagues participate in the parades in Chicago, etc. So when the Illinois delegation goes to Washington, D.C. to march in the parade there, she goes with them. However, when she arrives, Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party who's organizing the parade, was giving really mixed messages and stating that Black women were not welcome. And the head of the Illinois delegation tells Ida B. Wells that if she's going to march in the parade, she has to march in the back. She can't march with the Illinois delegation. Well, Ida B. Wells was having none of that. She said, either I go with you or not at all. And the morning of the parade, she did not show up with the delegation, but instead she waited on the sidewalk. And then when they walked past, she jumped in and joined them so that she would walk with them. And because of this story, and because of the way that she was excluded for a long time, historians did not really recognize and understand how many Black women were actually in this parade. And it's quite a few, both in state delegations, in some of the delegations that were by profession, the education ones. And so I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Mary Church Terrell and Frances Harper. There's that constant kind of, you're welcome, you're not welcome. So, well, you're not really welcome in the parade. You can march in the back, but Black women insisted on being there. And they did take part, and they were a part of the parade. Marie Bottineau Baldwin also was in this parade as well. And I'll show this picture as well. This was from the 1912 parade in New York City. And you can see here that women workers want to end sweatshops. So these are the working women. And there's Alva Belmont marching by herself. So she was, again, kind of, she wanted to be with and have this sisterhood with the working class women, but then she wanted to march in front of them as well. And then this is a picture of the horsewomen at the front of the parade, which is, we saw that picture earlier that Mabel Lee was in this parade. Women also, in addition to the parades, they made their presence known with the pickets in front of the White House. These were quite famous, got a lot of publicity. They were arrested and jailed for blocking the sidewalk in 1917. They started in the winter. By the summer, they were being arrested. They were in jail all summer long, and in the fall, they were beaten. Alice Paul and others were force-fed. And finally, when word really got out in the newspapers about how these women were being treated, Woodrow Wilson had to call it back and allow them to be released. And they did keep picketing afterwards, but were no longer arrested. Women also understood that they had to control their own voices. And so the New York Times was against women's suffrage. It was an anti-suffrage paper. This quote is an old one. It's from 1859. And the kind of poster that you see on the right, these were quite well known. There's lots of these. There were anti-suffrage films, a lot of anti-suffrage rhetoric that really centered around how men would become demasculinized and women would become defeminized if they had the right to vote. And so women had to kind of take back the narrative. They had to control it. They had to put out the message that they wanted to put out instead. And so, for example, Ida B. Wells, I said, was a journalist. So when she started the Alpha Suffrage Club for Black women in Chicago, the first thing that she did was to create a record for them, a newspaper, the Alpha Suffrage Record. The national organizations, both the National Women's Party as well as NAWSA and many other organizations, also had their own newspapers. These newspapers cost them tens of thousands of dollars. They were very, very expensive. They put these organizations well into debt, but it was so important to them. Susan B. Anthony said it was really important that they have their own newspaper so that they could, quote unquote, sauce back their opponents. So it's just really key that they could be driving the good news that they wanted to share about women's suffrage, both with each other as an organization, as well as with men and with the country. And finally, they had to learn how to lobby. So here they are in Washington, D.C. They had to get an additional headquarters in Washington, D.C., in addition to New York, so that they could be in Congress basically every day. They lived in the suffrage house. Women from around the country would all come in so that they could lobby their local or their state legislators. And Maudwood Park, here you see with a congressman, and you see Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president, in front of the White House, because they also lobbied very hard Woodrow Wilson as well. And they had to learn how to become comfortable doing that. They had to learn the techniques. They had to learn all the information about the congressman in order to successfully lobby senators to vote for the amendment. And they eventually did. How did they do all this? They needed money to make this a reality and do everything. So the National Women's Party kept, there's a 200-page typewritten document that lists every single donation that they ever got between 1913, when they were founded, in 1920. The dollar ones, the 50-cent ones, these were all absolutely key in order to have headquarters, parades, lobbying, etc. It all costs money. And you can see there, the big one is Alva Belmont, Mrs. Oliver Belmont, who gave $76,000 to the National Women's Party. So the contributions of her and some other very, very wealthy women who could give these extraordinarily large contributions were really key in enabling that huge publicity push that takes place in the 19-teens. And ultimately results in the passage of the 19th Amendment in August 1920. So what happens? Well, women right away want to register to vote so that they can vote in the presidential election in 1920, and they do all around the country. For Black women, if they were in Chicago in the Alpha Suffrage League with Ida B. Wells, or in New York with Irene Moorman, they were already able to vote, and they were voting in large numbers. However, if they were in the South, they did try hard to register to vote, but they ended up facing the same kinds of literacy tests and other laws that had been passed to disfranchise Black men. And by this point, Alva Belmont, who had previously, remember, even worked with Irene Moorman in 1909, at this point, she had the same attitude that a lot of the white women in the movement had, which was basically they weren't concerned. If Black women were disfranchised just the way that Black men were in the South, then that was okay with them. It wasn't okay with Black women who were really pushing white women in the National Women's Party, in the League of Women Voters, and even this new women's division of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation in the South. So all of these regional and national organizations pushing them to try to help fight against disfranchisement of Black women in 1920, but they were really unsuccessful pretty much up until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. For other women of color, it really depended on their citizenship status. So someone like Mabel Lee, who was an immigrant, because she was a Chinese immigrant, she was considered to be a quote unquote alien, ineligible to citizenship, and she could not naturalize. So she did not get the right to vote in 1920. And there's no record of whether she ever naturalized in the 1940s and 1950s when those laws were changed and all immigrants were allowed to naturalize to citizenship regardless of race. However, second generation Chinese Americans who were born here were citizens. And so when California passes the right to vote for women early, you see Chinese American women being able to register to vote as early as 1911. For other women of color, Latinas, for example, again, it depended on their status. Mexican American women, if they immigrated, were allowed to naturalize, and those, of course, who were already here and kind of in what had been Mexico and then becomes the United States after the War of 1845, they were citizens as well. So let me wrap up with a few words of some lessons maybe that we can draw from the movement. One is, I think, persistence and protest in the streets, really that a social movement to make change for women, to make such dramatic change. It really took patience, it took dedication, it took decades, a willingness to be jailed, a willingness to be in the streets, massive organizing and massive effort, as well as a lot of money as well. So I think we really should take some inspiration from their persistence. A second lesson, I think, has to do with the fact of that kind of exclusion and inclusion, the racism in the movement that we saw, and the fact that there were moments when they were prioritizing getting the right to vote for white women and excluding other women. And hopefully that's inspiration. That's something that has marred the feminist movement really up through today, and something that should really inspire us to do more, to be a more inclusive movement. A third lesson, I think, is about being a means to an end, which is human rights for all. And so all of that discussion around the many different reasons that women wanted the right to vote, they saw it as a human right that all citizens should have, all people should have. They also saw it as a means to an end, to access to professions, to birth control, controlling their bodies, to education, to better treatment, respect, all of these things. And really also to gain rights for women, to end gender discrimination, and really ultimately then to bring human rights to all, regardless of identity. And finally, I want to end with this idea that the right to vote can be easily lost. And that is to say that in New Jersey, the New Jersey State Constitution in 1776 referred to voters as they. And then they actually passed some statutes in the 1790s that referred to voters as he or she. So there was a period of almost 30 years in which women in New Jersey could vote. This changed in 1807 when they passed a new law that said all free property, only white men could vote. Now, when women had that opportunity to vote, they had to be property owners. So they had to be married in order to be property owners. And it applied to white as well as Black people. There was no race listed there. And so we have records, historians have started combing the records, and they found over 160 women on the voting records. They found some free Black men as well. They haven't discovered any free Black women, but that doesn't mean that they won't. So what happened in 1807? Why did they lose the right to vote? Well, there were accusations of voter fraud. People started to say that, well, they might actually be married women, and they weren't supposed to be married women because they had to be property owners. Or maybe it was someone who was actually enslaved and not free. So the solution to eliminating fraud was to limit the right to vote to just white male property owners. And I think this is really important. It's part of this backlash against women voting, part of a backlash against a growing free Black population in New Jersey as well. But it's really a reminder to us that accusations of voter fraud can be used to limit the power of, or to limit the right to vote. It's crucial to citizenship, it's crucial to political power, it's crucial to having a voice, it's crucial to human rights, but it remains unavailable or just difficult to access to many people. And I think today we need to think about that and continue the fight for the right to vote. And I will end there and be very happy to take your questions.
Joan, thank you. Thank you for the really wonderful and fascinating presentation. I learned so much from your talk, and I can only imagine that our audience did as well. In fact, they are already chiming in with questions. So if you're ready, I can read the
Absolutely.
first one, and maybe you want to grab a sip of water while I'm reading it.
Sure.
Okay. So our first question comes from Joseph Rosenblum, who asks, in the US, was there the same division between suffragists peaceful and suffragists not just peaceful as in Britain?
Oh, that's a great question. So the many suffragists here were inspired by the movement in Britain, in which the women were a bit more radical in their protests. And in fact, the idea of having parades, of the picketing of the White House, all of that was really inspired by some of the more street protests that we saw in England. However, not all women suffragists here approved of that. And so there's a somewhat of a split. It's not exact, but where the national organization, NASA, really saw themselves as more moderate and thought that that was unladylike, as well as impolitic, because it was alienating the very politicians that they were trying to lobby to pass the right to vote. So they were against some of those methods. They were very much against the picketing at the White House. And then Alice Paul's National Women's Party was the one behind the pickets and the more radical protest and the closer ties to suffragists from England. It's a great question.
Great, thank you. The next question says, of all of the women from different races and ethnicities fighting for their suffrage, is there any indication of which groups of men were the most supportive and sympathetic towards that fight as well?
That's another great question. So there has been a little bit of research done on that. And what some historians have done is look at the vote according to precinct in neighborhood in places like New York, where New York passed a referendum and passed the right to vote a couple of years before the amendment passed in 1920. And there they did find very strong support among in some of those working class neighborhoods where the labor activists, the garment workers were. And so the men in many of those neighborhoods, especially Jewish, Russian Jewish men, were voting pretty heavily for women's suffrage. There was also a pretty good turnout for women's suffrage in that Harlem neighborhood where Irene Moorman had her headquarters. So it's possible that, you know, we can credit her with some of that as well. Other than that, we can also look regionally, and there was much stronger support in outside of the South, which is really where the strongest resistance was. And when the amendment is finally passed, it will, although it's Tennessee, which is a southern state, that was the final state to ratify the amendment. The vast majority of southern states did not ratify the amendment and ultimately will ratify it later. But there was very strong resistance there, and that was based a lot on race and the fear that they would be enfranchising Black women, or that some of the ways in which they were disfranchising Black men would get some scrutiny. So they didn't want a federal amendment, especially. And also just stronger gender ideals about sort of proper womanhood, I would say.
Okay, terrific. We have a comment from Connie King, and that's followed by another question. So Connie says, thank you for an excellent talk. It was very good to hear. It was very good to hear about so many, quote, lost women, unquote, to bring integrity to historical narratives about the suffrage movement going forward. So thank you, Connie, for that comment. And the question is, of all of these relationships between women that you've studied, which stood out to you as demonstrating real solidarity across differences? And were there any particular areas of other power dynamics trumping gender solidarity that stood out to you as well?
That's actually a really interesting question. There were some very strong relationships. I mean, Susan B. Anthony was certainly friends with Frederick Douglass, even as he called her out on moments where he saw her as failing. So I think there's a lot of strong relationships that go across some of these boundaries, really, across many decades. I saw in New York City quite a bit of cooperation between the predominantly white women's groups and the Black women's groups. Quite a bit of cooperation in Chicago, actually, with Ida B. Wells. And in particular, she was good, pretty close to several white women, including one from Evanston, who wasn't, didn't get to go to Washington, D.C., but afterwards was really horrified by what had happened with the parade, invited her and her husband over for dinner, and Ida B. Wells graciously accepted. And she sort of said, we have to be stronger in fighting for rights than the people who are fighting against them. And so there's definitely, I think, a lot of coalitions, a lot of friendships, a lot of organization that's certainly successful. And I think if we also are looking at working class women, there was quite a bit of cooperation there, and quite a big role for working class women in the movement, especially in New York, but in many other places as well, in California, in other areas of the country. And again, moments where they were forming their own separate organizations, moments where they were part of the larger organization, moments where they were called out to speak on behalf of working class women, to argue, the case for working class women, and other moments where they were kind of just part of the larger whole and not necessarily representing working women solely.
Great.
I think that's an area that we need a lot more research on. I think there's a lot of stories there to be told. And one of the things that is very exciting is many of the newspapers have been digitized and you can search them. And so I think that's been a huge boon to historians, instead of having to sit in the archives, on microfilm and literally go through every page of the newspaper trying to find something. You can, these search engines are amazing. And I found a lot of information that way. So
yeah,
it's great.
If we could only get more of the 20th century newspapers digitized as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you noted that that question identified an area that is ripe for more research. Are you already working on another book project, or?
No, I am not. I am, I had been doing some follow-up work that's not fully in the book on Belmont, because I was just so intrigued by the fact that she, in November of 1909, begins to support working class women in the strike, and then in January meets with Irene Moorman, and just thought that thinking about all three of those women and who they are and what they come to the movement for and with, and how they see each other and what they want from each other, and how they are also, cautious and a little bit, not trusting of each other. That's been a really fascinating story that I've been working on. But I have not begun a new book yet, so I'm not sure what that will be.
Okay. Yeah, I found Alva Belmont fascinating as well, and the document that recorded all of the donations, including her $76,000 donation. I'm curious where that document lives and how much work has been done on it.
Oh, so that is in the National Women's Party papers. It's available on microfilm. I think it's through the Library of Congress, although it might be there. I'd have to look up my reference, so I apologize. I don't remember exactly which library it's in, but it is available. And that's something else that, my previous book on funding feminism, on wealthy women who funded the women's movement, I look at the suffrage movement as well as expanding access to higher education for women and the birth control movement and the labor movement. And, I was guilty of the same thing, which is that when I was previously working on women's organizations and their activism, I would get to the financial folders and sort of gloss over them and get to the next one. I really wanted to read more about why their motivation for working on what they were doing. But it turns out that the how really depends on understanding their finances and where they got the money to do what they wanted to do. And so that's what kind of launched me into looking at the women donors and got me looking at this book, which is really fascinating. And, they just could not have had the kind of headquarters and PR campaign and everything that they did in the 19-teens without that huge infusion of money from some very, very wealthy women.
Yeah. We do have another question, if you're willing. So this one's kind of fun. Has there been a movie or documentary made about this great period of unrest in women's history that you would recommend?
Well, there was a TV movie, Iron Jawed Angels, about the National Women's Party. I'm not sure I would recommend it. It's a little fictionalized. And there are some documentaries. I cannot, not one that comes to mind off the top of my head, but certainly there are some. There's one about Ida B. Wells. There's a documentary about Anthony and Stanton. There are some other, so I wouldn't be able to recommend one, but there are definitely documentaries on various women and aspects of the movement.
Great. How about one more?
Sure.
Okay, all right. So we hear a lot about archival silences these days, and I'm sure that is something that you were up against throughout your research on this book. So what gaps did you notice within the archive on this subject, and why do you think those gaps exist?
Well, I think one of the biggest gaps really is moving away from just the national organizations and really getting into what was happening at the local level and really all around the country. And so I was not doing the primary research in each of those states. I was really depending on all of the historians in the last 20 years who have been doing that really hard work. And I think that's helping to really change our understanding of the movement by helping us to really understand who was active and why. And when you broaden out from the national organizations, really when you see people like Irene Moorman and many others. And I also think that women were working for the right to vote as well as many other rights at the time. And many are working through their women's clubs, they're working through the suffrage organizations, but not just the suffrage organizations. And so it's a little bit more complicated to tease out what they were doing for women's rights or for suffrage specifically, but in all these other kinds of organizations, in the WCTU, in their women's clubs, in other places. And then in particular, of course, for women of color who were less welcome and were doing the bulk of their work through the National Association of Colored Women, which is not a suffrage organization per se, right? Has a much broader agenda, but certainly suffrage was one of the parts of its agenda. So I think there's been a lot more work done in all of these areas. And what I was really trying to do in the book was pull a lot of that together.
Excellent. So a couple folks chimed in with movie recommendations or documentaries.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, good.
So someone recommends American Experience's The Vote. And someone else notes that PBS has a series on the suffrage movement. And then the third person just comments, amazing history we should never allow to be forgotten.
Wonderful.
So I think that concludes our questions. So unless we have any last minute questions popping up, this is your chance to pick Joan's brain. I guess I'll just say thank you for being our guest of honor tonight and for sharing all of your wonderful research. Again, I just learned so much, and it's
been really wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the good work that the library does. It's really a treasure, and Philadelphia is very, very lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that.